Our lesson today from the Acts of the Apostles recounts that moment in church history when, after the ascension of Jesus into heaven, which we remember just this past Thursday in our church calendar, but before the day of Pentecost, which is next Sunday in our church calendar, and the coming of the Holy Spirit, the apostles are gathered together, starting to get their plan together for the future of this movement. Peter stands up among all of the believers who had gathered in Jerusalem, and he explains that the 12 apostles need to be restored. The number 12 is important. Jesus had chosen 12, and so they needed to choose someone to take Judas' place in the lineup. Peter insists that the person who will fill the slots needs to have the correct pedigree. The person to fill Judas's place needs to have been with them throughout all of Jesus' ministry, from his baptism through his ascension. And only 2 people in the crowd seem to qualify. And so there's this fellow, Joseph Barsabbas, or Justus, and Matthias. And the both of them are put forward for consideration. They cast lots to see whose name would be chosen. So that meant the candidate's name were written on pieces of or little pot shards, little bits of broken pottery, and then placed into a basket, and the basket was shaken. And the first piece of pottery to pop out was the one that was believed to be God's choice. And so Matthias' name popped out of that basket first, and he was deemed to be God's chosen replacement for Judas. And so the symbolic number of 12, like the ancient tribes of Israel, it had been restored, and then the day of Pentecost soon arrived. But what about this guy, Joseph Barsabbas Justus? Well, first of all, let's just call him Barsabbas for simplicity's sake. What became of him? After all, he'd known Jesus just as well as Matthias, yet Matthias is the one with his own feast day on our calendar, not Barsabbas. And so what did he do after not being chosen as one of the official apostles? Well, we don't know. We don't have any record of his activity except for maybe the mention of someone who may or may not have been he who traveled with Paul and Barnabas. He either gave it all up, went away angry because he hadn't been chosen as one of the official 12, or he chose to stick it out, even without the notoriety of being one of the big 12. If I get to choose, I like to think that Barsabbas stuck it out. I also imagine that he began to see his non-selection as more of a blessing than a curse. The 12 apostles ended up having big jobs. Some of them were really well known. They seem to have, at least some of them, led these really highly public lives and had important roles to play in the development of the early church. Their public roles carried certain expectations for the people and responsibilities toward the people, and so their ministries were perhaps impeded by being so well known. Barsabbas, on the other hand, had the privilege of not being such a public figure. He could go about his work and his ministry unimpeded by the day-to-day demands of being one of those high-profile apostles. Barsabbas could claim his own apostleship, even without the official title, and go out as one sent to do God's work. He could do ministry. He could do it the way that Jesus taught for it to be done, that is, quietly and without expectation of public recognition or accolade. He could serve God's people without anyone knowing about it. The apostles, they weren't afforded such a luxury. And in some sense, the place of the official apostles in the life of the church became exactly what Jesus preached against. I mean, just look at me. I'm supposedly one of the local authorities on things spiritual and ministerial, and unlike Barsabbas, for better or for worse, everyone knows my name. I wear these fancy outfits that cost way too much. I stand up in front and I get the most important looking seats. I talk more than anyone else does. I get fancy titles before my name and on the mail that I receive. I get credit for the successes at the church even when I deny having had anything to do with them. And I get paid to do it all. This is hardly what Jesus had in mind when he sent his apostles out with only the cloak on their back and the sandals on their feet. No, real ministry isn't accomplished by folks with fancy vestments and big long titles. Real ministry is accomplished by folks who are unknown and unacknowledged, who simply claim ministry as their own and then allow the Holy Spirit to empower them to do it. Yet one author writes that we have become, in many senses, a sedentary Christianity. He calls us couch potato do-gooders. He mentions how easy it is to write a check to help another engage in ministry, but that it would be good for our sedentary selves if we found more active ways to engage ministry with our own hands and feet. I like to think that Barsabbas got active after the lot casting was done. He wasn't chosen to be one of the Big 12, but I'll imagine that he still claimed the role, just like anyone can. I also like to imagine that he was probably all the more successful, even than Matthias, who was the one chosen. Being an apostle means literally being one who is sent to accomplish a task, not to just go on a tour and see what there is to see. So the question we ask ourselves then, in this in-between time, between Jesus' ascension and between the coming of the Holy Spirit, is what is it that we are being sent to do? What are we going to claim as our own ministry? What are we claiming as our work as apostles, even if it is never known by anyone but God? How are you making the risen Christ known in the world today? As Barsabbases, the fortunate ones are able to do ministry as Jesus taught, quietly, earnestly, and lovingly. So claim your ministry. Pray for the Spirit's guidance and power to accomplish it. And despite what the world does tell you or doesn't tell you about your worth in the life of the community, be the apostle that God has chosen you to be.